At the Crowell Clinic, doctors delivered infants unlike any others. Babies born without umbilical cords, their origins a mystery that turned the clinic's history into a macabre legend. What if a clinic built to protect mothers and children was hiding something unspeakable? In the heart of Hartford, where the winters were long and the air smelled of burning coal, the Crowell Clinic rose like a pristine monument to care. Its whitewashed bricks stood against the gray skyline, and its windows gleamed with the assurance of order. Families walked past it with relief, whispering that this was the one place where life was preserved, where safety was guaranteed. Mothers touched their bellies and smiled when they looked at it, believing it to be a cradle of beginnings. No one wanted to believe that behind its immaculate walls, death was being crafted with precision, dressed in rituals so strange that even the shadows refused to whisper their details. The clinic was presented as a miracle of modern medicine, established after the influenza waves that had taken too many children. Dr. Miriam Crowell was praised as a savior, her image placed in local newspapers beside photographs of swaddled infants, her calm smile promising comfort in an uncertain world. The town accepted her as a gift, as if she were beyond error, and in that unquestioned faith she found her shield. What no one understood was that the white walls were not chosen only for cleanliness. They were chosen for silence, for the ability to erase memory. A white corridor swallows stains quickly, and when lit by strong lamps, it blinds those who walk through, numbing them to the details they should have noticed. Every surface became a canvas for something else, something not meant for public sight. Visitors felt peace in those halls, but peace built on deception is only another form of anesthesia. The waiting rooms were filled with soft chairs, the smell of lavender, and kind nurses whose voices never rose above a hush. Yet, somewhere deeper in the building there were rooms without windows, chambers where mothers never stepped. These spaces were not built for care but for observation, where acts of control were disguised as medical necessity. Patients were ushered into recovery beds with warm blankets, but the real work began once their eyes closed, once their minds drifted under the weight of sedatives. To most it seemed like healing. To Dr. Crowell, it was an opportunity to test her design. Her obsession was not born from anger or cruelty in the way people understand it. It came from an idea, a fixation that nature had made a mistake in giving children a connection to their mothers. The umbilical cord, she once wrote in a hidden note, was not a lifeline but a chain. She spoke in polite tones to her colleagues, praising mothers publicly, yet in her private notebooks she described birth as an imperfect transaction. To her, every child should begin unmarked by history, severed from ancestry, freed from the weakness of memory. She wanted to craft a generation that arrived in silence, without cords, without ties, as if they belonged to no one but her design. This belief, terrifying in its coldness, was hidden beneath the routine motions of a healer. Her smile disarmed suspicion, her calm explanations silenced doubt, and her reputation became the mask under which she operated without interruption. It is easy in hindsight to ask why no one saw. But the clinic was not simply a building. It was an idea woven into the life of the town. Women gathered there for charity events. Children played near its steps. The mayor spoke of it during parades. To question its sanctity would have been to question the very foundation of Hartford's pride. That was the brilliance of Dr. Crowell's design. She made her work indistinguishable from virtue. Every mother wanted to believe that she was safe there. Every father signed the forms without reading, convinced that progress was on their side. The building became a cathedral of trust, and in cathedrals no one searches the shadows. Inside, the shadows stretched longer than anyone imagined. The clinic had been built with a basement that was never part of the official blueprints shown to donors. Few ever saw it, and fewer still returned with the clarity to describe what they had witnessed. Down there, the walls were not bright white but a dull ivory, thick enough to trap sound. Records were kept in cabinets that smelled of iron, and instruments were arranged like relics waiting for ceremony. This was where the true clinic existed, beneath the floorboards of public care. It was not a place for saving but for reshaping. History is written by the survivors, but in Hartford, the survivors never spoke. They carried grief like a burden too heavy to put into words. They said their children were lost to natural tragedy. They repeated the lines the clinic gave them. Yet their eyes often lingered too long when passing its gates, as though their silence was a form of warning, one too fragile to voice aloud. What the records never explained was that grief itself became a weapon. Each family broken by unexplained loss reinforced the illusion that death was ordinary, that nothing unusual had happened. By normalizing tragedy, Dr. Crowell erased her crimes beneath the weight of routine sorrow. To the outside world, the Crowell Clinic remained a symbol of progress. The white walls gleamed as mothers entered in hope, not knowing that some would never leave whole again. The smell of antiseptic masked the absence of life, and the hum of electricity in the halls lulled visitors into comfort. Yet, behind the locked doors and soundproof walls, a design more terrifying than neglect was unfolding. This was not the chaos of a careless doctor. This was a mind obsessed with control, a mind that hid cruelty behind the softness of a smile. Evil rarely enters with a scream. It arrives in silence, dressed in white, convincing you it has come to heal. As the chapter closes, the story is only beginning. The clinic still stands in memory, untouched by time, its image preserved in faded photographs that show nothing of its shadows. The people of Hartford never truly learned what was taken from them, and the walls of the clinic remain, innocent to the eye, guilty to the soul. Beyond those white walls lies the true story, of a doctor who smiled too much, of mothers who trusted too deeply, and of children who were never given the chance to cry. And it is in this silence, in this unsettling quiet, that we step further into the darkness. Dr. Miriam Crowell was known for her smile. It was the kind of smile people trusted, gentle but steady, the smile of a woman who had devoted her life to the safety of mothers and children. In Hartford, people whispered that she was not simply a doctor but a gift from God, an angel who had chosen to wear a white coat instead of wings. She spoke softly, never rushed, and when she looked into the eyes of a patient, she gave them the sense that their suffering mattered. The town adored her, and that adoration was her mask. The truth was that Miriam Crowell never smiled because she felt warmth. She smiled because it worked. It disarmed suspicion, created intimacy, and made it easier to hide the obsessions that consumed her. Her colleagues described her as meticulous, her office shelves stacked with journals that she read late into the night. Yet what no one saw were the private notebooks she kept locked away. These were not filled with medical notes but with diagrams that had no place in medicine. She redrew the female body again and again, but in her sketches the womb was always detached, the cord never attached. She imagined birth not as a natural miracle but as a flawed system that needed correction. She wrote about severing ties before life began, ensuring that the child would enter the world untouched by the weakness of dependence. To the outside world, she praised mothers for their strength. In her private words, she saw them as obstacles, carriers of flesh that diluted her vision of perfection. Her obsession began after years of witnessing stillbirths, or so she claimed. Others believed she was moved by grief, but her grief had hardened into something colder. She convinced herself that nature had erred, that the fragile cord connecting mother and child was the source of weakness and failure. She told herself that if she could remove that connection, she could create children who belonged to no one but themselves, or to her. In truth, she wanted to author life in a way that erased every trace of human history. Each new child would be blank, unclaimed, and silent. This idea possessed her, and once it had taken root, there was no separating her from it. The clinic gave her the perfect theater. She designed procedures that no medical book recorded, careful to wrap them in the language of innovation. She spoke of modern methods, of advancing the future of childbirth. Few dared to question her. Those who did were met with her smile, that steady mask that seemed to assure them they were in safe hands. But behind that smile, she hid rehearsed routines that reduced birth to something more like ritual. Sedation was heavier than necessary, timing more controlled than natural, and the instruments she prepared gleamed with a precision that felt ceremonial. To the mothers, it was medical care. To Dr. Crowell, it was performance, each step a part of her design to reshape the act of bringing life into the world. Her cruelty was not impulsive. It was methodical. She treated each procedure as if it were part of a script she had memorized. First came the quieting of the mother, ensuring she would remember little. Then came the delivery, carefully altered so that what should have been a bond between two bodies became something else, something detached. When she looked at the infants, she did not see them as sons or daughters. She saw them as vessels, as proofs of her theory, as objects that could either satisfy her or be discarded. She catalogued them with symbols only she understood, tiny marks drawn in her hidden ledgers, as if she were creating an archive of her own private scripture. What made her most dangerous was how easily she played both roles. Upstairs, she was the healer, the calm presence walking the halls, her hands clasped as she asked about Mother's comfort. Downstairs, in the hidden chambers, she became something else entirely, a director of silent rituals where the cries of the newborn were either muffled or manipulated into silence. She rehearsed how long a body could be deprived of oxygen before it passed beyond saving, how blood could be redirected in ways no textbook described, how a child could be born appearing whole yet missing the origin that tied it to another human being. These acts were not accidents or errors in practice. They were rehearsals of control, the cold testing of boundaries no sane physician would cross. The townsfolk continued to adore her. When she appeared in church, heads bowed in gratitude. When she attended gatherings, she was welcomed as a guest of honor. People marveled at her patience, her endless work hours, her soft voice. No one noticed the hollowness in her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached them. It was not that she felt nothing. It was that what she felt was not human compassion but satisfaction at how well her mask held. Her cruelty thrived because it was hidden behind the illusion of virtue, and the more she was praised, the more untouchable she became. Those who worked closest to her sometimes caught glimpses of her true nature. A nurse once spoke of how Crowell lingered too long while holding a newborn, staring at it not with warmth but with calculation, as though she were judging it against some invisible measure. Another remembered how Crowell insisted on handling certain deliveries herself, barring others from the room. These whispers never left the walls of the clinic, for to accuse her would be to accuse the very foundation of Hartford's pride. And so the silence grew heavier, until it became part of the structure itself. What made Miriam Crowell terrifying was not just her obsession but the way she wrapped it in normalcy. She laughed softly, offered tea to nervous mothers, and promised fathers their children would be safe. She never raised her voice, never acted rashly. Her evil was not loud. It was quiet, systematic, and patient, like a clock ticking in a room where no one notices the sound until it is too late. Each procedure she designed was another step toward her vision, and with every child she touched, she felt closer to perfecting it. The smile remained her greatest weapon. When doubts arose, she smiled. When grief threatened to pierce the illusion, she smiled. Even when infants disappeared, she stood by parents with that same expression, convincing them that tragedy had struck beyond anyone's control. People wanted to believe her. They wanted to trust the doctor who smiled too much. And in that trust, they gave her the freedom to continue. The story of Miriam Crowell does not end here. This is only the unveiling of the mask, the revelation that behind the soft-spoken healer lived a mind consumed by ritual and control. Her smile, so carefully crafted, was not kindness but the first stage of her design. As the walls of the clinic grew thicker with secrets, her methods grew darker, preparing for what would come next, the silence of children born without cords, and the ledger that would record them not as lives, but as entries in her private scripture. The silence of the Crowell Clinic was not accidental. It was designed. Every sound that should have filled its halls, the cries of newborns, the nervous voices of mothers, the reassuring tones of midwives, was subdued, muffled by thick walls and the calculated use of sedation. For the townsfolk, this quiet seemed like peace. But beneath that calm was something far more sinister, a silence so unnatural it carried the weight of absence, of lives removed before their presence could ever be known. It was in this silence that Dr. Miriam Crowell performed her darkest work, the experiment that would define her legacy. The method was simple in its cruelty, but perfect in its deception. Mothers would arrive swollen with expectation, their bellies carrying the weight of new beginnings. They would be met with Crowell's soft smile, reassured with gentle words, and guided into rooms where the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. There they would be given sedatives stronger than any needed for childbirth, ensuring that their bodies would not remember the pain and their minds would not recall the details. When they awoke, they would be told their children had not survived, that fate had played its hand, that tragedy had come for them as it had come for so many others in that era. The white walls and kind voices made it believable, and mothers, already weak from labor, accepted their loss with grief that could not be questioned. Yet not all of these infants were gone. In the hidden chambers of the clinic, Dr. Crowell and her small circle of trusted assistants carried out procedures no medical board would have sanctioned, no textbook would have recorded. Their goal was not to save life but to edit it, to reshape the very first moment of existence. The infants were delivered not with the natural cord that tied them to their mothers, but through methods that erased this connection entirely. In her notebooks, Crowell wrote that the cord was an unnecessary tether, a primitive flaw in design. She experimented with ways to deliver babies who bore no physical sign of origin, children who seemed to have arrived not through human connection but through her hands alone. What made this horror even more disturbing was its methodical nature. Each infant was recorded in her private ledger not by name, but by symbol. Circles, crosses, triangles, marks that resembled alchemical signs more than medical codes. To Crowell, these children were not individuals but entries in her grand experiment. She tested how long their tiny bodies could endure separation from oxygen before revival, how their skin reacted to altered fluids, how their cries could be muted with adjustments no parent would ever witness. Each death, when it occurred, was written not with sorrow but with calculation. She saw loss not as tragedy but as data, each failed child a step closer to her vision of creating life stripped of weakness. Whispers began to spread among the townsfolk, though no one dared speak them aloud in public. Too many women had left the clinic with empty arms, told their children were stillborn. Too many funerals were held without bodies. Quiet questions were asked in kitchens and parlors. Why did so many losses happen at Crowell's clinic, when she was supposed to be the most skilled of doctors? But grief silenced suspicion. To accuse a beloved healer of cruelty was unthinkable, and so families accepted their tragedies as fate. They whispered but did not confront, mourned but did not question. This was how silence protected her, how her reputation fed the very system she was building. In those hidden rooms, the silence was not only the absence of cries but the presence of ritual. Instruments were laid out in exact order, polished until they gleamed under the dim lamps. Assistants moved as though following choreography, their hands trembling not from conscience but from the demand for precision. The procedures were not rushed. Each was performed with the patience of someone crafting something greater than the sum of its parts. Sometimes infants were displayed before the doctor, their small bodies altered in ways no one outside those walls could have comprehended. She studied them with the gaze of a collector, a scholar dissecting a mystery. The mothers above believed their children were gone, while below, the doctor tested how far she could bend life before it broke. The most haunting detail was the method she perfected: infants delivered without cords. In the ledgers, these were marked with a special symbol, one that resembled a key without teeth. She wrote that these were the pure children, the ones unmarked by ancestry. Their existence was a grotesque triumph in her mind. To others, it would have been an abomination, a violation not only of nature but of the very idea of humanity. Yet she saw only progress, convinced that she was cutting away weakness, editing away the flaws of ordinary life. Not all of these infants survived. Many perished within hours, their fragile systems unable to cope with the alterations forced upon them. But Crowell did not grieve. She studied. She adjusted her methods. She refined her tools. And with each failure, she grew more certain that she was closer to success. This was not the work of a healer but of a mind consumed by obsession, a mind that saw human life as material to be shaped, catalogued, and, if necessary, discarded. The townsfolk began to notice other oddities. Families who questioned too much seemed to vanish or move away. Records of certain births disappeared from official logs. Nurses who left the clinic never spoke of their time there, as though fear itself had silenced them. A few mothers whispered that they had heard cries echoing faintly from below the floors even after being told their children were gone. These whispers never became accusations, but they lingered, feeding an unease that no one dared bring into daylight. The experiment of silence thrived because it was hidden behind normalcy. Crowell attended church, walked through town with grace, and offered condolences to grieving parents with the same soft smile she had always worn. No one saw the ledger she kept hidden in a locked drawer. No one saw the infants catalogued by symbols instead of names. No one saw the ritual precision with which she erased the most natural bond of all. The silence was her masterpiece, her camouflage, and her cruelty. In the end, the greatest tragedy was not only the children taken but the way grief was manipulated into acceptance. By normalizing loss, Crowell ensured that no one would see the pattern until it was too late. Each mother believed her tragedy was her own, each father thought his grief unique, and in this isolation they never realized they were part of something far larger, something designed. It was not fate that had stolen their children. It was a method. It was a plan. It was the cold hand of a doctor who smiled too much and believed she had the right to rewrite the very rules of life. As the silence deepened, so too did her obsession. The experiment was no longer about isolated cases but about building an entire generation that bore no trace of their mothers, no evidence of their past. What began as whispers of stillborn infants would soon grow into something far more chilling. The realization that nature itself was being edited, reshaped in secret, while the town above continued to praise the doctor who claimed only to heal. And in this silence, the stage was set for the next chapter of her work, when ritual would move beyond experiment and into the realm of ceremony, where every act of cruelty became not just practice but performance, and the walls of the Crowell Clinic would echo with horrors that no one dared to name. The deeper one entered the Crowell Clinic, the less it felt like a place of healing and the more it resembled a stage built for performance. To the mothers, birth was meant to be a sacred threshold between life and death, a moment of raw chaos where pain gave way to the cry of a child. But for Dr. Miriam Crowell, that moment was too uncontrolled, too messy, too human. She sought to strip it of chance, to turn birth into a repeatable ceremony where every movement followed a script, every sound was managed, every outcome bent toward her design. She no longer called her work procedures. In her private journals, she called them rites. The rooms where these rites unfolded were arranged not for efficiency but for control. Instruments were laid out with ritualistic precision, their metal polished to a reflective gleam that caught the dim light in unsettling ways. Nothing was left to accident. The table was positioned in the center of the room as though it were an altar, and the mother, unconscious from heavy sedation, was placed upon it like an offering. Assistants were made to stand in silence, forbidden from speaking except when commanded. The air itself seemed to hang still, as though sound was a disruption to the sanctity of the ritual. Birth was no longer an act of nature. It had become a performance of power, orchestrated by a mind that could not tolerate imperfection. Crowell's obsession with control revealed itself in the smallest details. She timed the cutting of flesh by the ticking of a metronome she kept on a shelf, its steady click echoing through the chamber like a mechanical heartbeat. She believed rhythm stabilized the process, though to her assistants it sounded more like the countdown of something dreadful. She instructed them to move in patterns, circling the table clockwise, never counterclockwise, as if breaking that order would undo the ritual. Even the fluids that collected during delivery were not disposed of immediately but gathered in vessels, as though they were relics meant to be studied, catalogued, or preserved for unseen purposes. The most haunting part of her ceremony was how she redefined silence. A newborn's cry to her was not the first breath of life but an error. She sought to eliminate it, to deliver infants into a world that met them not with sound but with quiet submission. She experimented with ways to suppress the initial gasp, believing that silence at birth would break the natural chain of dependence. In her journals, she wrote that the cry tethered the child to the mother, called for her instinct, and re-established the connection she had tried so hard to sever. To erase the cry was to erase the claim. And so she tested ways of muting it, sometimes pressing against the chest until the infant's mouth opened with no sound, sometimes manipulating the air in the room so that the cry was swallowed before it could echo. These methods were never meant to preserve life. They were meant to reshape it into something obedient to her vision. She spoke often to herself during these rituals, her voice steady and quiet, as though delivering sermons to an unseen congregation. She would murmur about purity, about beginnings free of history, about children who carried no trace of the mothers who bore them. Her assistants listened in silence, too fearful to question her words, but the cadence of her speech suggested she believed she was conducting something greater than medicine. She believed she was cleansing humanity of its oldest flaw, connection. And in her pursuit of this impossible idea, she turned the act of giving life into the most calculated form of cruelty. The rituals escalated in complexity as her confidence grew. No longer satisfied with simply erasing the cord, she began experimenting with the very order of delivery. Sometimes she delayed a child's first breath for minutes, timing how long the body could be suspended between life and death without surrendering to either. Other times she altered the fluids the infant was exposed to, replacing them with mixtures she had prepared from her own studies, as though she could rewrite biology with substitutions. She recorded each outcome in her ledger, not with words of regret but with symbols and marks, treating each child as though they were nothing more than part of an equation. To the outside world, the clinic remained untouched by suspicion. Mothers were told their children had been lost to stillbirths, and fathers signed papers without hesitation. The white walls above hid the rituals below, and Crowell herself continued to attend church, community gatherings, and charity events with her smile intact. But within the clinic, each ritual left its trace, and those who served under her began to carry the weight of what they had seen. A nurse once fainted during a procedure when Crowell instructed her to hold a newborn in silence, forcing its breath into stillness while she scribbled notes. Another assistant confessed years later that she believed the doctor's rituals had more in common with religious sacrifice than with medicine. Yet none of them spoke at the time. Fear and loyalty, reinforced by Crowell's manipulative kindness, kept them in place. Her methods became so refined that failure itself seemed deliberate. Not every child survived, and Crowell accepted this with unnerving calm. She called the failures necessary sacrifices, their deaths proof of flaws in the design she sought to erase. In her eyes, nature was wasteful, clumsy, imprecise. She was determined to correct it, to impose order where chaos had once reigned. Each failure was catalogued with the same care as each success, their absence woven into her ritual as if death itself were part of the ceremony. The ritual of silence extended beyond the infants. It consumed the families as well. Mothers awoke to hear their children had not survived, and the absence of cries confirmed the lie. Fathers returned home with grief heavy enough to silence any doubts. In this way, Crowell's ceremonies did not end in the chamber. They reached outward, reshaping the lives of families who never knew they had been part of her experiment. Every tear shed, every unmarked grave, became part of her performance. The silence grew heavier with each passing year, settling over Hartford like a shroud that no one dared lift. What made Crowell's work most terrifying was the devotion with which she carried it out. She was not careless. She was not reckless. She treated each ritual with reverence, as though she were serving a higher law than medicine or morality. In her journals, she wrote of herself not as a doctor but as a custodian of purity, someone chosen to deliver a new kind of humanity into the world. Her smile in public was the mask of kindness. Her rituals in private were the anatomy of obsession, dissecting the natural world piece by piece until nothing recognizable remained. As the years passed, the rituals blurred the line between science and cult. Crowell no longer sought approval from peers, no longer cared for recognition. She had built her own system, complete with symbols, order, and sacrifice. The clinic became her temple, the white walls her veil, and the infants her offerings to a vision only she understood. And while the town above continued to trust her, below the floors of the Crowell Clinic the anatomy of ritual perfected itself, growing bolder, darker, and more detached from the world it claimed to serve. The silence had now become permanent. It was no longer an absence but a presence, a weight that lingered in every room and settled into the very bones of the building. Mothers continued to enter, families continued to trust, and Dr. Miriam Crowell continued to smile. But behind that smile was no longer a healer. Behind it was a mind that had turned life into ritual, grief into performance, and silence into the most enduring legacy of all. And it is in this silence, in this perfection of ritual, that the next horror was prepared, not just the alteration of birth, but the vanishing of families themselves, those who dared to question the sacred order of the clinic and paid the price for their defiance. The Crowell Clinic was never accused openly. No policeman crossed its threshold with suspicion. No minister dared to whisper its name from the pulpit. But the town began to feel something strange, a hollowing out of families who asked too many questions. Grief alone was acceptable. Grief paired with doubt was not. Those who mourned quietly were comforted. Those who mourned too loudly were erased. It began so subtly that no one noticed at first. A farmer and his wife who demanded to see their infant's body were told the paperwork was delayed. Then weeks later they were gone, their house emptied, their land sold to a distant cousin no one had met before. A seamstress who questioned why her child's death certificate bore the wrong date was admitted to the clinic for exhaustion, and never returned. The town explained these vanishings as misfortune, illness, the wanderings of broken souls. But in truth, the disappearances were part of the design. Dr. Miriam Crowell had perfected not only her rituals but her control of perception. To her, families who questioned her methods threatened the silence she had built so carefully. Doubt was infection, and infection had to be cut away. She employed methods as precise as her surgical hand. Records were altered with steady ink, death dates rewritten, signatures forged so smoothly that no official ever raised concern. Memories were managed with subtle cruelty. Mothers sedated longer than necessary, fathers persuaded that their grief clouded their recollection, relatives warned by quiet officials that grief could turn into madness if they clung too tightly to suspicion. Over time, those who questioned found themselves alone, isolated, and then gone. The disappearances carried a ritual of their own. It was not enough for Crowell to silence a voice. She sought to erase every trace of its existence. Personal belongings were burned under the guise of sanitation. Photographs were removed from local archives. Even gravestones were left uncarved. To the public, it seemed as though the family had never been there at all. In her private notes, she called this purification of the record. It was the final step in her ceremony, not only the editing of birth, but the editing of memory itself. Those who survived carried scars not on their skin but in their minds. A mother who lost her child at the clinic never spoke of it again, her silence so complete that her surviving children grew up not even knowing a sibling had once existed. A father who once demanded answers grew withdrawn and disappeared into alcoholism, until one night his body was found in the river. Townspeople said despair had driven him to it. None asked whether his despair had been sharpened by careful hands. It was easier not to ask. The town began to adopt the same rule that governed the clinic: silence. Yet silence has a weight, and Hartford began to feel it pressing down. Entire streets seemed haunted by the absence of families who had once lived there. Neighbors looked away when someone began to ask questions, afraid the same fate would fall upon them. Children were warned not to wander too close to the clinic's back gates. There was no law forbidding it, only a quiet understanding that danger waited there. The disappearances reshaped the town into something subdued, a place where grief was expected but inquiry forbidden. Inside the clinic, Crowell refined her control further. She had begun to see the vanishing of families as an extension of her experiment. Just as she removed the cord from infants to sever them from their origin, she severed families from the community to protect the purity of her silence. She came to believe that erasing memory was as important as erasing the cord. A child without a cry, a family without a trace, both served her vision of a world unmarked by history. This was not an afterthought but a calculated expansion of her design. She had learned that cruelty was most effective when wrapped in the fabric of normal life. A mother vanishing after grief was not shocking, it was expected. A father drowning in despair was not alarming, it was natural. And by disguising her hand as fate, Crowell continued her work without suspicion. The assistants knew. They had seen patients sedated far too long, seen orderlies carry belongings into the basement furnace, seen Crowell's careful hand scratching out names in ledgers. Some tried to leave, but leaving the clinic did not guarantee freedom. A midwife who attempted to report her concerns to officials was found lifeless in her home. The death ruled influenza. Another nurse vanished during a journey to visit her sister. The explanation left at that. The few who remained learned that silence was the only safety, that complicity was the only way to survive. They whispered nothing, carried their guilt quietly, and continued to serve the doctor who smiled too much. The disappearances became so common that they ceased to be seen as strange. The town grew used to absence, used to empty houses and unanswered questions. The mayor called it migration, families seeking opportunity elsewhere. The church called it the natural scattering of a grieving people. Only in hushed corners did people admit that those who disappeared always seemed to have one thing in common. They had once questioned the Crowell Clinic. But no one dared speak that truth too loudly. To name it would be to invite it. Dr. Crowell thrived in this climate. She was the town's healer, the mourner's comforter, the benevolent figure who absorbed grief and gave back only calm. Families trusted her even as others vanished. She knew how to hold a hand at just the right angle, how to tilt her head in sympathy, how to say the words that soothed without answering. She knew that grief made people pliable, and she used that pliability as skillfully as she used her scalpel. The disappearances were not only a way to silence suspicion, they were proof of her mastery. She could shape not only life and death but memory and history. In time, the clinic was no longer just a building. It was a force that governed the town. People walked past its gates with lowered eyes, not out of hatred but out of fear that even noticing too much could mark them. The disappearances had achieved their purpose. They had built a wall of silence higher than any brick, a wall that kept the truth buried. Families were not only broken, they were erased, rewritten, purified from the record as though they had never existed at all. And so the stage was set for the next revelation. It was not only in whispers and vanishings that the truth would emerge, but in the discovery of what had been left behind, the hidden ledger that chronicled every act of cruelty, every erased child, every silenced family. For while Crowell controlled the living, she left traces in ink that would one day betray her. Time has a way of burying secrets, but it also has a way of unearthing them. The Crowell Clinic, long closed and abandoned, became a husk of white walls streaked with age. Its windows cracked, its doors chained, it stood as an empty shell, a memory most of Hartford tried to ignore. The townspeople told their children to stay away, whispering of ghosts and curses, but the truth hidden within was far heavier than superstition. It was not a haunting of spirits but of records, the careful work of a mind that had catalogued its crimes with the same precision it once used to wield a scalpel. It was here, in the dark belly of the basement, that the ledger was found. The discovery was accidental. Workmen were assigned to clear the clinic in preparation for demolition. They moved slowly, their boots kicking up dust that carried the faint smell of antiseptic even decades later. In one corner of the cellar, behind a false wall of plaster, they found a locked cabinet of iron, its surface streaked with rust. The lock was broken with tools, and inside, beneath stacks of rotting linens and sealed jars that no one dared open, they uncovered a thick book bound in cracked leather. Its cover was unmarked, but when they opened it, the air seemed to shift, as though the silence of the clinic had been waiting for this moment to breathe again. The ledger was unlike anything expected. It was not written in names but in symbols, carefully drawn circles, crosses, spirals, and shapes that resembled keys, arrows, and constellations. Each symbol was followed by dates, short notes, and marks of success or failure. To the untrained eye, it looked like the scattered notes of a mystic. But as historians examined it, patterns emerged. The dates matched hospital admissions. The symbols corresponded to families who had reported stillbirths. The marks of success were infants who had been delivered without cords. The marks of failure were the ones who had not survived the ritual. What chilled the investigators was not only the content but the tone. There was no sorrow in the words, no hesitation in the records. The handwriting was neat, elegant, the script of a woman who had written with patience and clarity. She described the severing of cords not as loss but as achievement. She noted silence at birth as triumph. Deaths were catalogued with a cold detachment, as though they were merely errors in a scientific formula. There were hundreds of entries, hundreds of children who had been erased, recorded only as symbols in a book no parent was ever meant to see. The ledger also contained notes on families. Beside certain entries were additional marks, small lines that seemed to indicate whether the family had accepted the explanation of loss or had begun to question. Those who questioned were marked differently, often followed by annotations that matched the disappearances that had plagued the town. It became clear that Crowell had not only altered the lives of infants but controlled the fate of entire families. Doubt was not tolerated. Families who resisted silence were catalogued as obstructions, and soon after were gone. The ledger did not say how. It did not need to. The absence of further marks told the story. As the ledger was studied, its pages revealed a worldview more disturbing than any single act of cruelty. Crowell believed she was creating a system, an order that erased the chaos of human life. She wrote about a future where children entered the world without history, where mothers were irrelevant, where silence marked the beginning of life. She believed her rituals were the foundation of something greater, that she was not simply a doctor but an architect of purity. In her words, the cord was not a gift but a flaw, and her purpose was to eliminate it. To her, grief was acceptable, even useful, as long as it never became resistance. What she sought was not healing but control, not medicine but authorship of life itself. The ledger also revealed the ceremonial nature of her work. Sketches filled the margins. Diagrams of instruments arranged in circles, notes on the rhythm of the metronome, drawings of infants swaddled in unnatural stillness. She described the silence of their first moments as perfect quiet, and compared it to the still surface of water before it is broken. She called her successful children the pure ones, and described failures as returns to chaos. She did not see herself as cruel. She saw herself as chosen. Her smile in public was her disguise. The ledger was her confession. When the truth of the ledger was made public, it shook Hartford. Families who had lived with decades of grief began to realize that their losses were not fate but part of a design. Mothers who had wept in silence understood that their sorrow had been exploited. Fathers who had carried guilt discovered they had been manipulated. The town could no longer dismiss the disappearances as misfortune or the stillbirths as coincidence. The ledger tied them all together into a single tapestry of cruelty. Each symbol was a life, each mark a family broken, each page a record of silence imposed by a woman who had hidden her obsession behind the mask of kindness. Yet the ledger also created confusion. How could such atrocities have been hidden for so long? How could a community have allowed silence to reign so completely? The answer lay in the very structure of Crowell's cruelty. She understood that people will accept almost anything if it is wrapped in normalcy. She understood that grief isolates, that silence spreads faster than suspicion, and that reputation can shield even the darkest acts. She did not need to hide her crimes from the world. She only needed to make the world believe there was nothing to see. The physical ledger was eventually stored in a government archive, its pages photographed and studied. Scholars debated whether it should be displayed publicly or locked away forever. Some argued that exposing it honored the victims. Others feared that its ritualistic precision might inspire minds as twisted as Crowell's. In the end, it was sealed, accessible only to researchers, but whispers about its contents spread nonetheless. People spoke of the symbols, of the marks, of the pages filled with silence given form. The ledger became a ghost of its own, a haunting reminder that evil does not always come with rage or madness, but with calm handwriting and careful order. For Hartford, the discovery of the ledger was the moment when denial was no longer possible. The clinic was not simply a failed institution. It was a place where families had been broken, where lives had been stolen, where silence had been turned into ritual. The white walls that had once gleamed with pride were now stained with history. No amount of demolition could erase what had been written in ink. The ledger ensured that memory could no longer be purified, that silence could no longer be the only witness. And yet, even with the ledger uncovered, the weight of its truth was not easily carried. For every symbol that represented a child, there was a family who had once believed their grief was private. For every disappearance marked as obstruction, there was a home that had been emptied. The ledger gave answers, but those answers brought no comfort. They revealed only how deep the silence had gone, how wide the cruelty had spread, and how long it had been hidden behind the mask of a smile. The uncovering of the ledger was not the end. It was only the beginning of judgment, of trials without witnesses, of justice that struggled to find footing against a legacy of erasure. The town could no longer hide, and the name of Miriam Crowell could no longer be spoken with reverence. The smile that had charmed them was gone. What remained was ink, symbols, and silence given form. The ledger should have been enough. It should have spoken louder than any testimony, its symbols bearing the weight of hundreds of silenced lives. Yet when the time came for justice, the Crowell case fell into a void that mirrored the silence of the clinic itself. A trial was convened in Hartford, not long after the discovery of the ledger, but it was unlike any trial the town had ever known. There were no grieving mothers in the witness box, no fathers raising trembling hands to point at the woman who had broken their families. They were gone, erased by the very system she had perfected. The courtroom was filled instead with scholars, officials, and lawyers holding fragments of paper. Justice had no living voice to guide it. The figure of Dr. Miriam Crowell was conspicuously absent. She had died years before, her reputation intact, her funeral attended by the very family she had betrayed. To put her on trial was to put her shadow on trial, to wrestle with evidence against a woman who could no longer defend herself. Yet the townspeople demanded a reckoning, and so the proceedings moved forward, not against the woman but against the institution, the clinic that bore her name. The Crowell Clinic itself became the accused, its walls treated as accomplices, its staff summoned as reluctant witnesses. But witnesses proved fragile. The nurses who had once stood in silence on the lower floors remembered fragments but could not bring themselves to speak them aloud. Fear lingered even in death's wake, the old conditioning of silence pressing down on them like a hand at the throat. Some wept on the stand, insisting they remembered nothing clearly. Others claimed exhaustion, their memories too fractured to piece together. Crowell had not only silenced her victims but had trained her assistants in silence as well. Their words faltered, their courage crumbled, and the courtroom filled with hesitation. The ledger was entered into evidence, its pages projected for all to see. The symbols, neat and deliberate, covered the screen like a hidden language exposed. Experts testified to their meaning, cross-referencing dates with hospital records, linking them to families who had disappeared. Yet defense lawyers argued that symbols alone were not proof. They claimed the book was a personal journal, the ramblings of a woman obsessed but not criminal. They suggested the disappearances were coincidences, that grief had been woven into conspiracy by scholars hungry for scandal. Without mothers to speak, without infants to present, the argument gained ground. The jury listened in silence, their faces heavy with uncertainty. The trial became less about fact and more about philosophy. Could evil be judged if it was carried out in silence, without confession, without direct witnesses? Could symbols stand in place of screams? The town divided. Some insisted that the ledger was a confession clearer than any spoken word, that its neat handwriting was proof enough of her intent. Others said the dead cannot be tried, and the living cannot be punished for shadows. The court wrestled with these questions, and the proceedings stretched on, day after day, each argument echoing the same emptiness. There were no witnesses left to accuse. Families who had once whispered suspicion were gone. Their absence was felt more powerfully than their presence might have been. Empty benches in the gallery reminded everyone that silence itself was the most damning testimony. Yet silence is fragile in a courtroom, easily turned into doubt. Lawyers spoke of the unreliability of memory, of the dangers of rewriting history with fear. They painted Crowell not as a monster but as a misunderstood visionary whose notes had been taken out of context. Each word cut deeper into the town's wound, erasing what little certainty remained. In the end, the verdict was hollow. The clinic was condemned as negligent, its records deemed unreliable, its reputation stripped. But negligence was a word too small for the scale of its crimes. The ledger was sealed in the archives, labeled as evidence but never officially declared proof of murder. The trial ended without resolution, without true justice. For the families that remained, it felt like a second erasure. Their grief, once silenced by Crowell, was now silenced by the law. The trial's failure became its own legacy. Scholars argued about it for decades, citing it as an example of how institutions protect themselves, how silence can outlast even death. The Crowell case became a study not in justice but in its absence. The courtroom had echoed with emptiness, its benches filled with absence, its verdict weighed down by uncertainty. Evil had operated so carefully, so methodically, that even when exposed it resisted judgment. Crowell's genius was not only in her cruelty but in her design. She ensured that when the day of reckoning came, there would be no voices left to testify. For Hartford, the trial left a scar deeper than the clinic itself. The town could no longer pretend ignorance, but it also could not claim justice. The white walls had been condemned, the ledgers stored away, but the silence remained. Families still lowered their eyes when walking past the ruins. Children still whispered of disappearances. The truth was known but never named officially. It lingered in the air like smoke after a fire, visible only when the light struck it just so. The story of the trial was not one of triumph but of haunting. The courtroom had been filled not with voices but with absences, not with witnesses but with ghosts. And when the gavel struck its final blow, it sounded less like justice delivered and more like silence continuing, stretching forward into the future. Yet even in this failure, the truth had escaped. The ledger could not be unseen, the symbols could not be unread. Crowell's mask had been torn away, and though the law faltered, history would not. The trial without witnesses ensured that her cruelty would never again be mistaken for kindness. She had escaped justice but not memory. And sometimes memory, though fragile, is the only verdict that endures. The silence of the courtroom gave way to the silence of remembrance. The families who had been erased were not returned, the children marked only by symbols were not restored, but their absence had been made visible. The trial ended with nothing more than condemnation of a building, but in the minds of those who listened, the weight of silence became impossible to ignore. And so, the legacy of Crowell's cruelty did not die in the courtroom. It lived on, waiting to shape laws, waiting to alter how grief and doubt would be treated in generations to come. And from this void, from this hollow verdict, rose the need for remembrance. A memorial that would one day stand where the clinic's walls had been, a mark that silence could not erase. The Crowell Clinic was demolished in silence. No ceremony, no gathering of townsfolk, only the sound of machines tearing into walls that had once gleamed white and pure. Dust rose into the air and drifted over Hartford, as if the town itself was being forced to breathe in the remnants of what it had once worshipped. People stood at a distance, watching quietly, unwilling to come closer. They wanted the building gone, but they could not bring themselves to face what it had represented. By destroying its body, they hoped to bury its memory. But the memory was heavier than rubble. After the trial without witnesses, Hartford struggled with how to live with what had been revealed. There were no graves to visit for most of the children, no names to carve into stone, no families left to remember them. The town carried absence as its inheritance. Mothers who had once trusted the clinic looked back on their silence with shame. Fathers who had accepted the doctor's smile replayed every moment when they could have asked harder questions. But guilt, like grief, isolates. People bore it privately, turning it over in their hearts without ever sharing it aloud. It was the younger generation who demanded more. They asked why the clinic had been allowed to operate unchallenged for so long, why families had been erased without resistance. They asked why grief had been accepted as ordinary when it should have been unbearable. Their voices stirred something the town had buried, and soon a movement began to raise a memorial. Not just for the children who had been erased, but for the silence itself, for the fact that an entire community had chosen not to see. The memorial was built on the land where the clinic once stood. It was simple, a field of white stones, each one unmarked, representing the children recorded only as symbols in the ledger. At the center stood a single slab of black granite, engraved with words chosen not to comfort but to confront. Here we remember what silence erased. Visitors came quietly, laying flowers at the stones, touching them as though they might connect to lives that had never been allowed to cry. The memorial became a place of reckoning, a reminder that silence is never neutral. It either protects the innocent or shields the guilty. In Hartford it had done the latter. The discovery of the ledger and the failure of the trial rippled far beyond the town. Laws were changed to protect mothers from forced sedation, to require independent witnesses at births, to ensure medical records could not be altered without oversight. Scholars taught the Crowell case in universities as a study of institutional evil, a warning that cruelty does not always wear the face of rage but often the mask of kindness. Policymakers pointed to Hartford when arguing that systems must guard not only against negligence but against obsession, against the quiet madness of a single mind given too much trust. Yet the changes in law could not undo the past. The ledger's pages remained heavy with silence, its symbols unmoved by new rules. What haunted those who studied it was not only the scale of cruelty but the simplicity with which it had been hidden. Crowell had required no weapons, no public violence. She needed only trust, reputation, and the willingness of people to accept grief as ordinary. Her power had come not from force but from compliance. And that realization unsettled more than the crimes themselves. Philosophers began to speak of the Crowell case as an example of evil in its purest form, not explosive, not chaotic, but careful and patient. Evil that waits, evil that plans, evil that thrives in the gaps where no one dares to look. It does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it wears the face of care. Dr. Miriam Crowell had been all of these things. And the town, eager for comfort, had embraced her until it was too late. The memorial became a gathering place not only for grief but for reflection. Survivors of other tragedies came there, sensing in its silence a language they understood. Teachers brought children to walk among the stones, telling them that silence can be as dangerous as violence, that trust can be a weapon when placed in the wrong hands. Some wept openly. Others stood still, staring at the black granite, unable to move. All of them left with the same unsettled truth. The echoes of the clinic had not faded. They lived on in memory, in law, in fear, and in the knowledge that such things could happen again. For in the end, the greatest horror of the Crowell Clinic was not that one woman had carried out her obsession, but that she had been allowed to do so for years, wrapped in the protection of a community that refused to see. Evil thrives in silence, and silence thrives where people choose comfort over truth. That was the lesson Hartford was forced to learn, and it is the lesson that lingers still. The story of Miriam Crowell is not only history, it is warning. We look back at her rituals, her ledger, her smile, and tell ourselves we would have noticed, we would have resisted, we would have spoken. But silence does not announce itself as cowardice. It arrives as politeness, as trust, as the willingness to believe the lie because the truth is too heavy to bear. It is in that space that cruelty builds its altar. It is in that space that evil writes its symbols, certain no one will ever read them. The white walls are gone now, the rubble cleared, the ground seeded with grass. But the echoes remain, carried in the stories told by survivors, in the laws rewritten, in the field of unmarked stones that mark absence as presence. They remind us that what happened once can happen again, that the mask of kindness can always hide a darker intent, and that silence, if left unchecked, is the most dangerous accomplice of all. And so we leave you with a question, one that history itself cannot answer. What do you think? Could this happen again in another place, behind other white walls, under another smile that seems too kind to doubt?